With us today, we have Robert Sutter, who is going to talk to us about Taiwan and how Taiwan fits in somewhere between China and the United States of America. Robert Sutter is professor of practice of international affairs at the Elliott School of George Washington University. He also served as director of the school's main undergraduate program involving over 2,000 students from 2013 to 2019. His earlier full-time position was visiting professor of Asian Studies at Georgetown University from 2001 to 2011. A PhD graduate in history and East Asian languages from Harvard University, Sutter has published 22 books, over 300 articles, and several hundred government reports dealing with contemporary East Asian and Pacific countries and their relations with the United States. His most recent book is Chinese Foreign Relations, Power and Policy of an Emerging Global Force, and that was last year, 2021. Sutter's government career from 1968 to 2001 saw service as senior specialist and director of the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Division of the Congressional Research Service. He was National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and the Pacific at the U.S. government's National Intelligence Council. Sutter was also division director in the China division of the Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Professor Sutter is certainly well qualified by education and experience to talk to us today about Taiwan and its relationships with China and the USA. Over to you, Robert. I'm glad you're here. You have to unmute yourself.
Thanks very much for this wonderful opportunity for me to share some thoughts with you about Taiwan and what it means for Americans. That's going to be my focus. I have a handout which is available for you as you need. You can. The idea here is that you'll have something to look at later on that will help you understand what the talk is about, because we're covering a lot of ground. It's a very complicated issue. We have to think about the point of view in Taiwan, points of view in Taiwan. We have to think about America, and we have to think about the People's Republic of China, and so and their interactions. But my focus is going to be heavily on the American side, looking at the American involvement and what this means today, because what you'll find is that there's an awful lot of concern about the Taiwan issue today. The concern, of course, is magnified now that the Russians have invaded Ukraine. So some commentators equate the situation there with the situation between China and Taiwan today. This is quite common. And the asymmetry in power is even worse in the case of Taiwan. It's much weaker than the People's Republic of China. So this kind of thing is something that's common. And I'm going to try to help you and help myself as well to understand better the situation and to understand what's important to know about it. And so that's my purpose today, is to do that. I am going to cover history because history is important. It's something that determines much of what's happening today. And so, and that is, it's fairly accurate. You can look at history pretty well. If you try to speculate on what the People's Republic Beijing is going to do tomorrow, it's much harder to do that accurately. And so, so bear with me, and we'll follow along. And I hope you stay with me through the discussion. And then I'll be happy to answer any questions at all that you have on this issue. It's been a key thing in my career. As you can see, you have a long introduction because I've been around a long time doing a lot of things. And almost all the time, Taiwan has always been one of these issues that we had to look at. So that's what I do, and I do it today as a professor. So it's so here we go. We're going to start off looking at the situation in the Second World War. That's a long time ago, but that's the beginning. Why is the U.S. so involved with Taiwan? Well, let's remember, China was our ally in the war against Japan. After Pearl Harbor, we united with China against Japan. And the leader of China at that time was a guy named Chiang Kai-shek. He was a general, and he ran the government that existed in China. The Japanese attacked in 1937. And so Chiang Kai-shek fought by himself pretty heavily until 1941, when the Americans intervened. And that was a big day for him because he really thought that Japan was going to be defeated. Once the Americans entered the war, he felt that Japan couldn't hold out in this regard. So, but the US involvement then becomes very deep. Chiang Kai-shek is an ally. Now, what happens though, it's a complicated situation. What we're going to see is dramatic changes, changes in one direction and another direction. This order that we are seeing in the world in this period is very uncertain in so many different ways. And unfortunately, folks, I think we're in one of those positions today as well. And so we don't have a clear sense of what the order is going to be. It's contested. And so you'll see a lot of dramatic shifts take place at this time. For example, so the US is allied with Chiang Kai-shek, and yet in the situation that emerges in China, and they work together to defeat Japan, and the US does the main work here. It does defeat Japan eventually in 1945. But China is not unified at this point. Chiang Kai-shek really doesn't control all of China. There's a good deal of it that's controlled by the Chinese communists, and the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong. And they have very different objectives than Chiang Kai-shek. They're enemies in many respects. They're not fighting with each other until the war with Japan ends, but they're very much at odds, and they're facing off each other from their military points of view. The headquarters of the communists were in the northwestern part of China, but they were scattered around other parts of China. Chiang Kai-shek only controlled about 1/2 of the territory of China, even less when the Japanese took over. But even in his prime, it was only about 1/2 the territory of China was under his control. And so when this happens, then the Americans have to figure out what to do. I mean, they don't want to inherit a civil war in China as a result of their defeat of Japan. And the other thing they were worried about was that the Soviet Union would come in on the side of the Chinese communists. And so they made a deal with Stalin at Yalta in early 1945. Roosevelt was in poor health, but he made the deal. He went to Yalta and made the deal. And the deal was that the Russians would help us to defeat Japan in China, and they would work to normalize their relations with the Chinese nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, even though they were continuing to support the Chinese communists. Well, this deal didn't work very well. And once the war with Japan ended, a civil war broke out in China. And the nationalists thought, Chiang Kai-shek thought he had the upper hand. He had a lot of power, he had a lot of military, he had more soldiers than the communists, but he didn't do well. His regime had become corrupt, and the motivation of the communists was much stronger, and their organization was much stronger. And they will defeat Chiang Kai-shek, and he will have to retreat to Taiwan. And so there he retreats to Taiwan in 1949. His forces retreat there in 1949. Taiwan had been a Japanese colony. It was returned to the nationalist Chinese in 1945 after the war was over. And Chiang Kai-shek sent his forces to Taiwan to occupy it. And then he was able to retreat there in 1949. And so that's the situation. And so he lost, and Truman, by this point, is fed up with the corruption of Chiang Kai-shek, and he stops support. In 1949, he stops support for the Chinese nationalists. He's not going to give them any more support, and he's waiting for the communists to take over, even though the Cold War is emerging. He doesn't like communists, but he was prepared to do this and trying to be pragmatic in doing this sort of thing. The result of this is that Chiang Kai-shek is left alone. The communists are preparing to invade. It's just a matter of time. Dramatic event intervenes. The North Koreans, backed by China, backed by the Soviet Union, invade South Korea. Truman does a 180 in policy, just changes overnight. And he says, we've got to hold the line against these communists expanding in Asia, just like we're holding the line against the communists in Europe. And what does that mean? It means that Chiang Kai-shek is now protected by the United States. This happens in June of 1950. US forces are deployed so that the communists cannot invade Taiwan. Air forces, naval forces do this. They patrol the Taiwan Strait, the narrow strip of water, 90 miles of, between the island and the mainland. They patrol that regularly with their Navy ships. And what happens after this is that the North Koreans attack, and then the Americans counterattack in Korea, and they're successful initially, and they go into North Korea. The communists in China say, don't do that. They warn, and then they intervene. And so we have 2.5 years of warfare between the Chinese communists and the United States. And this really hardens American attitudes toward China, toward the communist China, toward Beijing, and it boosts the support for Chiang Kai-shek. So Chiang Kai-shek and his government in Taiwan were very highly regarded in this so-called containment system that the US sets up in Asia. A whole series of bases and alliances and military deployments and economic embargoes and economic aid programs that were designed on the one hand to really hurt the enemy, and on the other hand, to support your allies and partners in the region. And this went on for 2 decades, through the 1960s, a very firm opposition to China in East Asia, and very strong support for Taiwan. And Mao Zedong wasn't accepting this. He didn't like it at all, but there wasn't too much he could do about it. But he would challenge from time to time. And there were 2 instances in the 50s where there was warfare between the communists and the nationalists in the Taiwan Straits that was quite significant. And it didn't really end until the US threatened Beijing with nuclear attack. Yesterday, Mr. Putin was talking about mobilizing his nuclear forces. It was that type of thing, only much stronger. And so the result of this situation is a very negative attitude between Beijing and the United States. Really, they're enemies, fundamental enemies, and Taiwan is a fundamental ally. And so it's a very tight, so much, 1949, Truman, first we're allies of Chiang Kai-shek, then we cut them off, and then they become allies again. Amazing type of situation, but the circumstances make it understandable why it would happen. Now, when he's in Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek takes on, his regime takes on, it's very authoritarian, very, very tough right-wing regime, controlling as much as possible they can, the society and the economy and so forth. And they undertake very good, effective economic and social policies, building up education, building up land reform, building up industries in Taiwan. And Taiwan really grows in the shadow of Japan, and it becomes the next generation of the economic miracle that will take place in Asia, led by Japan. And so, so this is a very good thing. However, in his initial years there, his regime there, not Chiang himself, but his people were very repressive in Taiwan. In 1947, there was a major uprising. The people in Taiwan were fed up with the corruption and of the government in Taiwan, the administration there, and they took control for a while. And then troops were brought in and they crushed them. Oh, maybe 10,000 people were killed. And from that time forward, they carried out what they called a martial law situation. And they kept that martial law situation, highly authoritarian, until for 40 years. And so the people in Taiwan, they did better in the 50s and the 60s as far as material welfare is concerned, business is concerned, even education and social freedoms were concerned. But politically, the control remained very tight. And bad things happened. These were, even up until the 70s, these human rights violations were very strong in Taiwan. And the people in Taiwan, there were 6 million people in Taiwan when Chiang Kai-shek came in. And he came in with about 2 million people from the mainland. Those 2 million dominated the political order. And so those 6 million were disenfranchised to a considerable degree. And the result of this is that they had a very different view, but they couldn't articulate it because the authorities were so strong and they couldn't do much about it. But that will change, and we'll see how this will change in a minute. Okay, but first we have to explain what happens next in this dramatic situation. The US and China decide to come together. They see that they have a common interest in working together, and they've got to do it. It's desperate for China in many ways. China by this time had become very dissatisfied with the Soviet Union. They were allied with the Soviet Union in 1950. They supported the attack on South Korea, for example. But by the 1960s, they were very much opposed to the Soviet Union. Lots of different issues. Ideological issues were important. How you dealt with the developing countries was very important. The Soviets basically were too moderate. You remember Nikita Khrushchev. I'm sure some of you remember him, the Soviet leader. And he was very harsh toward the United States at various times. Remember when he took off his shoe at the United Nations and condemned the United States and said, "We will bury you." Remember that? Some people might remember that. And then, but afterward, he moderated. And Eisenhower, who's the American president up until 1961, had a farm in Gettysburg. And Khrushchev went there and had a détente with Eisenhower at the farm. So the Chinese saw this and they were up in arms against this because this was happening at a time when the US was putting very tight containment against China. And so the result is that Mao became very dissatisfied with the Soviet Union. And he criticized them on many accounts. One second, please. But it reached a point where they started to have a border dispute. And the border dispute will emerge under a new leader, not Khrushchev. Khrushchev he bluffed a lot. This guy never bluffed. His name is Brezhnev. And he will come in and he will say, "We got a problem with China. They're really annoying us and they're doing bad things in us in the third world and disagreeing with us and so forth. We've got to put pressure on them." So he builds up his forces along the borders with China, beginning in 1964. The buildup you saw Putin do around Ukraine, very similar. It's also very similar, this buildup against China, to the buildup that the Soviet forces used against the Japanese in 1945, when they entered the war in the last couple of months of the war. In any event, Mao faced this threat. And at this point, he was in the middle of one disaster after another at home. The Great Leap Forward had collapsed by 1961-62. Over 30 million people died as a result of that. And then that was followed by the Cultural Revolution, which totally decimated the leadership of the party and the government. And so China was in really bad shape. So to restore order in the society, they had the military take over the cities of China to rebuild them, build the party and government structures there in 1967 and 1968. So this is the context in which you have an outbreak of border frictions with China and Russia. And in early 1969, this border friction emerges in public, and it will develop in 1969 to a point repeated border clashes, so that by August and September of 1969, the Soviet Union is doing things like this. It's going to people in Washington and saying, "What will you do if we attack China and destroy their nuclear weapons? Will you help us? Will you join us in doing this?" And they did this all over the world with all these different countries. This is a big signal to the Chinese that the Soviets really meant business. And by that time, they had such an advanced military along the border, and their military was so weak in comparison that Secretary of State of the United States in 1969 said the Soviet Union could invade China and occupy Beijing in a week. So China was under the gun. And in this context, we find a convergence. The US was sort of under the gun too. Explaining the US situation, some of you maybe remember this, 1968 was a particularly bad year for the United States. The situation in Vietnam, the US had been there for several years. It was a very unpopular war. Most of the combatants were draftees, and their families and others would march in Washington repeatedly. Every couple of months, we'd have 200,000 people marching on the mall against the war. And so this was a very big phenomenon that Mr. Nixon had to deal with. And the society was really coming apart in various respects. We found, just like some see it today, but it was a very bad period in US unity because of the war in particular, and the differences between the leaders in various ways. And so the upshot of this is that the Democratic Convention that year was very disastrous. We had demonstrators and knocking heads of, and it was all happening on television. We were just watching this and what the heck is going on in our country? And we found that the Republicans, much more organized at that point, very, very organized party, that
His screen has frozen, and I'm not sure why. I will try to get to him. Don, do you have his phone number?
okay.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I'll try to pick up. I'm trying to explain why Nixon made his overture to China at this particular juncture. The situation in Vietnam, he needed help. In addition, the Soviet Union under Brezhnev had grown to such power that he had to have leverage against them. They were the driving force in the world. Believe it or not, at that time, people thought the Soviet Union would be the leading power of the world. And that would continue for several years after this. So the result of this is that Nixon made his overture to China, and they met. And the Chinese, what did China want? Well, they wanted help against the Soviet Union, that's for sure. And Nixon was quite willing to do that. And at the same time, the Chinese wanted Taiwan. That was fundamental for them. And they made the US back away from its commitments to Taiwan. They said, you've got to break relations with them. You've got to break your defense treaty with them. And that would, of course, made Taiwan very vulnerable to the Chinese communists. But Nixon was prepared to do that. But he didn't tell anybody. He kept it a secret for a good deal of time. It really didn't become known that he had promised this to the Chinese leaders in 1972 when he visited China. And Kissinger had promised it a bit earlier. And so this was a big issue late for the communists, for the PRC government. And so the result here was that Taiwan became this issue. At first, it wasn't isolated. They didn't break relations right away. It took a while. Carter broke the relationship. And this then made Taiwan isolated. And the PRC was beginning then to make overtures to Taiwan to bring them closer to China so that they could unify on terms that were agreeable to the PRC. So the regime in Taiwan was against this, but so were the people in Taiwan, even the people that weren't part of the regime, because they didn't want to be under the rule of the communists either. And so this is a big dilemma that we'll see going forward. But the point here is just that the US goes back and forth, and now it's in a position where it's established the relationship with the PRC. It values that relationship for a whole range of strategic reasons, and they're later enhanced by economic and other reasons, and that Taiwan is not nearly as important. And in some respects, it's a problem for the regime in making advances in dealing with China. Now, the recent context of the relationship is what the next section of the outline are various turning points that take place in this relationship. And I think the most important one is Tiananmen. And you probably remember Tiananmen, and the reaction of the Americans to that crackdown in 1989. that alienated so many Americans from the government in China and Beijing. At the same time, this was the period of the end of the Cold War. And the whole rationale of Nixon's opening to China and sacrificing Taiwan was, well, we need China against the Soviet Union. That's the rationale. And so now that rationale was gone. The Soviet Union was fading away. And so those two things are fundamental in changing American attitudes. And the third thing that happens is that Taiwan now, the old guard has, Chiang Kai-shek died in 1975, his son died in the late 1980s. And so the regime is changing. It's still sort of a one-party state, but they're having a lot of elections in Taiwan. Electorate is demanding this in Taiwan. And so the result is ever more the old regime is losing power, and this parties, and particularly one party that represents the people in Taiwan who were there in 1945, before the people from the mainland came, those folks are much more influential. And eventually they'll take some power, not right away, but they'll take power over time. And so therefore they're a new element. And what do they want? Well, they don't think about China the way Chiang Kai-shek thought about China. They think that China's over there. It's not, we're not China, we're Taiwan. And so they have that kind of a mindset, which will be, I think, quite important in explaining the difficulties we're having in dealing with China, this issue in US policy in recent years. What happens here, the next event that's worthy, needs consideration, is that in the middle of the 1990s, there's a big crisis. The people that want Taiwan to be more independent of the mainland, they lobby inside the United States and get support for this position, to have their president, Taiwan president, come to the United States and make a visit, go to Cornell, and that's where he got his PhD, give a speech, but come to the United States. This was the infraction. And Clinton said, okay. Everybody in Congress thought this was a good idea, except one senator. Everyone else thought it was a good idea. We should do it. They were preparing to pass legislation requiring it. So Clinton really had to do it. And so he did do it, and China went ballistic. They had live fire exercises with ballistic missiles and all sorts of warfare and military air and naval power demonstrating in the Taiwan Straits. And this went on for months. And it really didn't subside until the US under Clinton sent 2 carrier battle groups to Taiwan to calm the situation. But it showed how volatile the situation was. And so so what we need to look at now, so this is what we have, what we're inheriting. The recent drivers of this situation include the following. In 2016, we have an election in Taiwan, and these are full elections, very democratic. And the president who wins is in the party that's opposite of Chiang Kai-shek's party. And the previous government under Chiang Kai-shek's party, called the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party, he had ruled for 8 years, and he had been very moderate toward Beijing, almost accommodating to Beijing. And the people in Taiwan at first liked that, because it was very disruptive with the cross-strait tensions that we talked about beginning in 1995. They wanted that to calm down. And so they voted for this guy. And he did a good job in doing what he did. But eventually the people in Taiwan, while they built economic and other connections with the mainland, they became anxious that they were under Beijing's sphere of influence, that they couldn't protect themselves against China, and China might want to squeeze them and force them to come to be part of the Communist Party ruled government. And they definitely didn't want that. And so they voted for the other party, a landslide, in 2016. Beijing sees this, and they say these people want Taiwan independence, and we're dead set against that. And so they start applying lots of pressure on Taiwan. They don't attack them, but they apply military pressure, diplomatic pressure, and economic pressure in various ways. And so, and in this kind of dangerous situation, the US president doesn't want to jeopardize his relations with Beijing. The President Barack Obama in 2016, and he wants to follow a reasonable policy with China and keep the relationship with China sound. And so he doesn't change the policy that was followed at this point, a policy which is basically US policy. Most presidents follow the policy like Nixon did, reaching out to the Chinese, giving them a very high priority, and making sure they're not upset significantly over the Taiwan situation. And so Obama followed that kind of a policy rigorously. And so, so that's that development. Then it changes. Donald Trump becomes president in 2016. He himself doesn't care about Taiwan. He's articulated this in various ways. He doesn't care. But his people are very focused on Beijing. They see Beijing as a threat in a lot of different ways, and particularly in Asia. And they see the need for shoring up Taiwan. And so they carry out a policy designed to shore up Taiwan economically, strategically, and diplomatically. And the US right in the front of the effort doing this. And this is something that Beijing sees and is obviously very much concerned about this. So why is this happening? Why are we having the, and then I should add that Mr. Biden becomes president. And he becomes president. At first, he doesn't have a policy that's very anti-China. In 2019, read what he says. He doesn't take a very strong position on China. Doesn't like them, but not a big deal. But by 2020, he's very tough on China, and his people, many of them from the Obama government, just like Biden, they don't follow that strict one China policy that was done before. They are very helpful to Taiwan and continuing the kinds of buildup of security, economic and diplomatic support for Taiwan that we saw in the Trump years. So Beijing sees this, and it's a very unsatisfying situation. So let's look at the situation we face today. See, the key drivers that drive US policy to be positive toward Taiwan now are as follows. There are 4 of them. Beijing is applying military, all this pressure, military, economic, and diplomatic pressure on Taiwan in order to change its status quo and get Taiwan to unify with the People's Republic of China. And the US is determined to resist that, to change it back, to not allow them to do that. Number 2 is that Taiwan's location and its role in the Indo-Pacific region is very important for US policy as they try to counter Beijing's advances in the Asia-Pacific region. These are seen as China's expansionist and is expanding in ways that are very detrimental to US interests and to US allies and partners. Then Taiwan is valued as a democracy, as a valued partner of the United States, and as a country that has a very high profile in computer technologies that is very valuable to the United States. And 4th, Taiwan is useful for US policymakers to show their dissatisfaction with Beijing on one point or another. It's probably also good. So these are the drivers, but they're also weakening brakes. There used to be brakes that made the United States keep on good terms with China, just like I tried to imply with Mr. Obama. He wanted to keep a good relationship with China. That's one of the biggest brakes in the past. US policymakers wouldn't go forward with Taiwan and upset Beijing significantly because they wanted to keep on a good relationship with Beijing. But that changed. Why? Well, Mr. Trump's administration, during that period, big change took place. They disrupted the relationship across the board. And so did they value the relationship? It never really showed very much. I don't think it mattered very much. Meanwhile, a second factor was that the governments in Asia that were allied with the United States or partners in the United States, like Japan and South Korea and some of the Southeast Asian countries, they didn't want the US to move forward with Taiwan in a way that would upset Beijing and upset the order in Asia. Again, Trump's policies had made that overtaken by events. And then the third break had been that you didn't want to give the government in Taiwan a blank check so that they could take provocative actions toward Beijing that were not in the interest of the United States. And a previous Taiwan president had done this with that opposition party. But the current president, the one elected in 2016, and she is the current president up to now, is very sober-minded, very balanced, very measured. And so she's just not that type of a president at this point. That leaves one big obstacle for the US, and that is China itself. Will China take forceful action against the United States if it moves forward in continuing to move forward its relationship with Taiwan? And so this is the nexus of the problem that we face today. And so we see Beijing has ever rising military power and related political and economic influence. That's why it's the break. It breaks US policy. So by 2019, growing Chinese pressure had weakened support of the ruling party, the Democratic Progressive Party, but Beijing's crackdown in Hong Kong offset that. So this progressive leader, her name is Tsai Ing-wen, she was elected in 2016, and she became steadily less popular. And it looked like her party would lose in the elections of 2020. But Hong Kong intervened. Beijing cracked down in Hong Kong. And everybody in Taiwan looked over at Hong Kong and they said, holy crow, that's what Beijing's going to do to us. And so we got to stay with Tsai Ing-wen and not have a more accommodating type of approach that the other party wanted at that point. And so the Biden government, as I said, they came to this situation with a background being a strict one China policy, just as Obama followed, but they changed. They said, no, we have to follow this very strong, keeping incremental support for Taiwan, diplomatically, politically, and militarily and economically. So what's at stake for Taiwan? For Taiwan, in this face-off, and it's getting very tense as we see every day. We see the military displays and this type of thing. Nobody's getting shot, but it's a very tense situation. So Taiwan, on the one hand, faces a danger of massive destruction in war involving China and the United States. If a war breaks out between the US and China over Taiwan, it'll be on Taiwan. And it'll be decimated in many ways. But the other side is that they'll be under the control of the People's Republic of China. And they're prepared to resist that, to oppose that. So that's the choice they face. But it's at stake for the People's Republic of China. Maybe I didn't explain enough on this, but Taiwan independence for them is fundamental. It's the top issue for them at various times. And when it's challenged. So they feel they just have to do it. They feel their legitimacy, popular support for them would collapse if there's a danger that it would collapse, and they don't want to risk that danger. And the leader of China, as we know, is a very assertive, very nationalistic president who is determined to have what he calls the China dream. And the China dream is a unified China, to unify Taiwan. So they really are committed to this sort of thing. For the United States, the loss of Taiwan would mean that the whole Indo-Pacific strategy would be compromised fundamentally. Allies like Japan would be very worried about this. And would they then change their alignment because of this? If China did this, they'd be in a much better position to dominate Asia. And strategically, if you look at that, America's strategists have felt this way for a long time. If a hostile power controls Northeast Asia, it's just like a hostile power controlling Great Britain and Northern Europe and Western Europe. It's the same threat. Imperial Japan showed that. And so that's very much against what the Americans want. And then to see this thriving democracy just taken over by this communist ruled government is something that they wouldn't want. But on the other side, they face nuclear war. The US faces nuclear war, the danger of nuclear war. I mean, so it's a very uncertain situation, a very perilous situation, as I point out in the discussion points. And this leads to a lot of debate in the United States. And so one debate is over, should the United States be clearer to Beijing as to what's at stake here? Clearer that if they attack Taiwan, we're going to help Taiwan. We're going to defend Taiwan militarily. And if you did that, of course, that would undercut all the understandings that you've built up over the years with Beijing about the one China policy. It would show that you have a de facto type of defense alliance with Taiwan. So this is a very difficult situation. So the administration over the years, administrations over the years have preferred to resort to what they call their one China policy, the US one China policy, which is not like Beijing's one China policy. Beijing's one China policy is Beijing is the government, legitimate government of China, and Taiwan is part of China, and therefore should be ruled by Beijing. The US doesn't buy that, hasn't agreed to that, but it's ambiguous. And it's very ambiguous about will they defend Taiwan. But what you've seen in this 4 years of improving relations with Taiwan under Trump and now under Biden is that I think support for Taiwan in this situation is higher than at any point I've seen. Even in the period when we still had a defense treaty with Taiwan, at least in the 1970s. And so this is quite a dramatic change. So what do we do about this? Do we agree that we should be much more explicit, say exactly this is what we're going to do, or should we remain ambiguous or strategic ambiguity, as they say? The second argument is that we're having an inevitable competition with China leading to an arms race. It is an arms race. It's an ongoing arms race. It's been going on for decades, actually, but now it would be accentuated. And this will lead to what they call the Thucydides trap. You'll be caught in this dynamic and you can't get out of it. And you'll just keep going until you have war. So Harvard Kennedy School has a very prominent person who talks about this issue a lot, and it's gotten a lot of attention. And then you have the third issue, which is that China's just growing in power. And so can the US protect Taiwan? Is it viable anymore? You can't just send your aircraft carriers through like Clinton did in 1995. They'll be annihilated. And so what do you do under these circumstances? And particularly when now we face a two-front type of challenge in Europe and in Asia. So this is another very common argument. And so it makes people very nervous about things. And so this observer, I'm not as nervous as some people. So I'm just this is a personal view here, which I'm going to close with. I think this can be done. You can manage this situation. You can manage the US-China tensions within this broad framework, and you use the US one China policy as you did before. You use it very flexibly. And Mr. Biden's people seem to be doing this. That's what they're doing. And it seems to be, and for me, it's not overly provocative. And it defends Taiwan, and Taiwan's in a stronger position as a result of it. So that's one reason I have confidence in the Biden people in doing this sort of thing. The second thing I have confidence is that Beijing remains very reluctant to get into military conflict with the United States. This is very important to keep in mind. Beijing does all sorts of nasty things or not so nasty things vis-a-vis the United States to weaken it and to undermine its interest in various places. And these in governance, in economics, and in security. But they avoid confronting the United States militarily. And there are real good reasons for this. And they did this under Trump. And Mr. Trump's administration and he himself was often very insulting to the Chinese. And yet they didn't do this. They didn't confront American power. And why? Well, they feel that number one, on Taiwan, why not do it on Taiwan? Well, first of all, Taiwan's not going anywhere. Are they going to lose Taiwan? Is Taiwan going to declare independence? I don't think so. You look at public opinion in Taiwan, they recognize that would mean war with China and they would be destroyed. They don't want to do that. And the US government doesn't want that. And so I think it's not going to change fundamentally in the near term. And so they may not like the trend, what's going on now, but they can wait. They don't have to solve this issue today. It's not that urgent. Secondly, they have big domestic preoccupations. I mean, look at Xinjiang, what they're doing there. What does that tell you? Well, they're not confident in how they control their country, and they feel they have to control in depth if they have pockets of dissonance in one sort or another. And so this too is, and they have many other things that they have to deliver on, and they have to keep the economy going. That's fundamental to their legitimacy. And so that's another. So if you have a war with the United States, then the economy is not going to go anywhere. It's going to be very damaged, and they know that. And so they don't want that to happen. And then the U.S. strategically remains very important. It's very dependent. China's very dependent on resources that come from the Indian Ocean, from the Persian Gulf in particular. And the U.S. controls those sea lines of communication. And one of the first things they'll do in a war with China is control it, and to make sure none of the Chinese shipping will go through. And they can do it. And the Chinese know this. And so at the end, I conclude with this point. I said, what should be the U.S. foreign policy toward Taiwan? I suggest continue the Biden administration's managing tensions with China, trying to avoid war with China. Mr. Biden does this repeatedly, while incrementally improving U.S.-Taiwan resilience in the face of China's challenges. And that's what they're doing. And so it's sort of saying, okay, I like what they're doing right now. And yes, I am saying that. As a practitioner over the years, and I've been working on this issue for well over 50 years, you find you have episodes of panic that take place. People running around with their hair on fire saying, well, it's going to happen, and the latest thing that happened by some commentators, they said, look at the Ukraine, Russia attacks, and then China's going to attack. And I think you just have to go a little deeper and understand the context a little better. And we can't solve this issue. I'm not arguing that we can solve it. We manage it. And I think we can manage it effectively, given what the current circumstances. If those circumstances were to change significantly, for example, if China felt it's really powerful now and it's much more powerful than the United States, then they may make the decision to do that. But they're not at that position yet. And I think we can assess that pretty accurately. Okay, so I've talked enough. I think we have plenty of time for questions, so I look forward to getting the questions.
Robert, thank you. Wow, what a tour de force, as we say. And you taught me a heck of a lot as you went through the years. At my age, many of them I've lived through, of course, but not as deeply involved, obviously, as you have been, both academically and in your assistance with the American government. Just to sort of recap in my little brain here at the moment, we do not, that is, the United States has no commitment, a formal commitment to Taiwan. Is that still true?
Yes, it's true. We broke our defense treaty. We ended it, and we have no official relations with Taiwan.
And the other thing I was curious about is the United Nations part of this story, in that at one time, as I recall, Taiwan was in the Security Council at the United Nations. And that was a big change when they were removed from that, and China filled that position.
That's correct.
And my question there is, would Taiwan be considered as a member on its own in the greater United Nations? When you look sideways at all those members, many of them are less economically powerful and less populated than Taiwan. And has there ever been a discussion about doing something like that, joining the General Assembly?
It was a very big issue, and it remains an issue in Taiwan. It was a very big issue under the more progressive Nationalist Party leader in the 1990s. And then it's a very big issue for the current government, the Democratic Progressive Party, representing more the people in Taiwan that were not part of Chiang Kai-shek's group. Those people have made, this is a big point for them. They want this to happen. But there's a recognition that, number one, Beijing is on the Security Council. It will never happen as long as Beijing's there. And number two, it's a real cause of tension with China. And so at various times, if they wanted tension with China, they would push this idea. But today, and I think in recently, they have plenty of tension with China, and they're not raising this issue as far as the government is concerned very much. They're worried about the tension, and so this is and it's not going to happen under current circumstances. So that's, but the idea is the idea there? Yes, sir. It's and the logic is just as you laid it out. It's that's why yes, they're important. They're a very important player in the world, and yeah, so it's they should be represented, but they're not. So the Biden administration is trying to do this in a informal way. And bring them back into the United Nations for meetings and work with UN related organizations. World Health Organization is one, and
Oh, yes, yes.
and the organization that that deals with communication with aircraft is another, and there are several others that the U.S. is working with Taiwan to prove their stature, but officially it's very difficult.
Yeah, yeah. You gave us kind of a one sentence allusion to today in the sense of what is China going to learn from the situation in Ukraine with Russia? I leave it to you.
Are you asking me to answer that?
Yes, please. Yes.
It's ongoing, isn't it? I think we don't know what the lessons could be because it depends on how it evolves. If it fails, if Putin fails in some way, this will cause China to recognize that the international forces and indigenous forces are significant, and they can't just. The Chinese have been pretty cavalier in supporting Putin in a variety of ways over the years. It does things in Syria, does things with Iran, and so forth. They tend to be supportive, but this one is in the world spotlight in a big way, and they're then put in a very awkward position because they want to maintain reasonable relations with the European countries, West European countries in particular, and with the United States. And so this solidifies antipathy toward China in the United States. And I think it solidifies more the wariness and certain amount of antipathy in countries in Europe. And so this is, they want to avoid that if they can. So there's a cost to China in supporting Putin, which hasn't been there before. And so, but it depends on how it all turns out. And I think if the resistance in Ukraine collapses and Putin, or he gets the regime there to compromise and give him what he wants, and then the issue is over, then China will move on. I think they won't change too much. I think the thing that would change them is if there's a significant setback for Putin and what he's doing.
Just looking for a moment at Taiwan. My understanding is it's about, and I always think Taiwan is some big, huge.
Yeah, no, it's not very big.
And it's the size of Switzerland.
Yeah,
very similar to the size of Switzerland.
Yeah.
But its gross domestic product per person is 3 times that of China. But of course, China includes 1 billion people who probably don't contribute that much. But at the same time, so its economic strength is enormous, but its physical size is about that of Switzerland.
It's highly salient in the recent days when we have this high-tech competition between China and the United States. This is probably the most important arena of competition between the United States and China, not the military side. I think this is more important on the longer term. And Taiwan is critical on computer chips. You want them on your side, and China would like to have them on their side if they could, but that's unlikely. But the point is, the U.S. does want Taiwan on its side in this competition with the PRC.
Thank you. I've used up my priority questions as the semi-host here. And I know Mal always has a question or three. Mal, can you speak up and give us?
Certainly. Robert, one of the apparent similarities between China and Russia is that they are led by a fairly autocratic, highly focused leader. And so when you answered Donald's question a few moments ago, the question of what did they learn? What is your sense of Xi Jinping? Does he learn in the sense that I think you were talking about? If Russia fails, if Putin fails, does he learn from that as far as you can, or is he, I've got my plan and I'm working it?
No, I guess I'm very much an evidence-based analyst, and I look at the circumstances, and I think circumstances have a lot to do with how these leaders act, particularly Xi Jinping. Now, for example, Xi Jinping has been cooperating with Russia closely since 2013, and it continued after Crimea. And he did this and in ways that were very detrimental to the United States and the countries affected. And it involved expansionism in Asia for Xi Jinping that Putin supported, and it involved Russian expansionism in the Middle East and Europe that Xi Jinping supported. Why did they do that? The US was weak. The US was seen as weak, as was Europe and Japan. And so they felt they could do it. It was an opportunistic thing. And this isn't based on my judgment. I was in charge of a study group of 130 people for experts from the United States and other countries on Russia and China. We did this over 2.5 years. So today, of course, you see that the US is seen as driving them together. Well, they maybe, but the point is what drove it in the past was weakness. And so and that's changed. So they have to adjust to the circumstances. And I think they will adjust to that. So I'm not sure, as I tried to indicate, the circumstances of Taiwan argue that, no, I'm not going to attack Taiwan. You know, I'm sure I would like to have Taiwan unified with China, and but I'm not going to be rushed into this sort of thing. He's very deliberative. And what are his goals? His goals are clear. He wants the China dream, which is a great power of China, a leading power of Asia, fully unified, and a great power in the world. He's very clear about that, and he's following that strategy to do that. But how he does it, I think, depends a lot on circumstances. And so he's that type of a calculating leader, it seems to me. At least, and of course, we don't know what's in his head, do we? And so this is what an evidence-based analyst does: is look at the situation and try to make and because that's what you have to do with China. Anybody that tells you they know what Xi Jinping thinks, you know, please don't have them on your program, you know, because that's just baloney. It's, no, I was the senior officer in East Asia of intelligence, and we were, you know, thousands of people fed into this stuff, and did they know what's happening in the head of the leader? No, don't know that. So we have to be humble about that. But I think the record, that's what the record shows. You adjust to circumstances.
Joan, can I give you a heads up? Because one of the questions in the question and answer column is, how do I get the handout from Professor Sutter? And so I'll leave that to you to fill us in when you come back towards the end of our program here to explain. But
Okay,
Since
one
we
of the
may lose a
questions-
couple of people, Donald,
yeah,
let me
one of the
just say that
questions,
the announcement that Joan sent out about the program to sign up
you can.
had an attachment in it. You may, all of you who may still have the announcement, that attachment is part of, but we can also resend it to you.
Right.
If
Right,
that's
if
not
you-
gonna-
I will put in the chat function my email. And then anybody who wants to have it, just put your name in the email. Okay?
Thank you.
Great.
Back to you, Robert. One of the questions is from Jay Forbes. would not China's militarizing the South China Sea, ignoring world maritime law and destroying democracy in Hong Kong, not help explain why there was Biden's change of how he viewed China in relation to Taiwan?
Yeah, I agree. Yes, I think that's China is seen. I'm in Washington. I've been watching this change in China policy very closely from the U.S. perspective. Why did it happen? How did it change? It's an awareness of all these kinds of challenges that the Chinese have been posing to the United States. It's not like Putin. It's not so in your face. It's all very incremental for the most part. And these are two notable ones that were mentioned by the person asking the question. So yes, and that has, and Mr. Biden has reflected that now that he's in power. He's reflected this very strongly. I think he believes it.
And I think another important question is from the audience, and that is, we've concentrated on China, U.S., and Taiwan, but is there anybody else out there in the world who is equally focused on Taiwan or on either side, I guess?
There's really only one, and that's Japan. Japan is very focused on this because they too, they recognize the strategic importance of Taiwan. If Taiwan is taken over by the PRC, they are extremely vulnerable. Just look at the map. Beijing can encircle them very easily. And so that's why many specialists think if the U.S. Fails to support Taiwan, and Taiwan is therefore taken over by Beijing, that the alliance that the U.S. has with Japan would come into big question. Because the Japanese would say, what good is this alliance? We're now surrounded. We have to find another way to protect ourselves, or we have to deal with Beijing directly. So it would be a very different situation. So yes, they are fundamentally concerned about this, just probably more than the Americans are. And others see it as important now. I think you find the Australians see it as important. And some of the European countries see it as important. And to the point now where the U.S. still sends warships through the Taiwan Straits, and they publicize that. They didn't do that under previous governments. Once they broke relations with Taiwan, even before that, they stopped talking about sending ships through the Taiwan Straits. They would go through occasionally, but it was never publicized. But in the last 3 or 4 years, they've been publicizing it directly, and there might 9 or 10 happen every year. They're joined by, every once in a while, by Britain, by Australia, by Canada, by France. They've all sent ships through the Taiwan Straits, signaling that they too are very concerned about this. So they share the concern, but nothing like Japan. I think Japan is fundamentally absorbed in this issue.
Thank you for that. Another question from the audience, Alan Christenfeld says, China is continuing to build a large high-tech military force while it espouses the idea that the U.S. is a declining spent power.
Mm-hmm.
Given these dynamics and the reality that propaganda and testosterone filled young PLA soldiers, sailors, and airmen want to prove their combat mettle, how long can China refrain from military adventurism? Where and when do you think it will start?
It's a very good point, and you always have to worry about this. I think it's a very accurate assessment. The circumstance it doesn't give enough attention to is Xi Jinping himself. This guy is a no-fooling leader, and if you don't do what he wants, he knows how to punish you. And so it's up to him. So these hot-headed people in the military are not necessarily going to get there's no door opening for them. No, they've got to do what this guy wants. And does he feel pressure to do this? I don't think so. Certainly nothing that really shows in his policy. So I think that this dimension, while considerably important, is something that I think he can manage quite well if he feels that this is not the time to do this. And he can change the subject and do something else. And I don't want to say get away with it, but just these hotheads would just have to be quiet for a while.
Under control.
Under control.
And G, do you think he's going to be there for life?
Well, he says he's going to be, he's not telling us when he's going to leave. So right now it's all set up for him to do another 5 years. And so he's just one of those dictators that take over. And that of course is a big danger. Whenever that power transition takes place, because he's incapacitated or dies, there's really no successor in the wings. We have nobody that we can point to say, this is the sure leader. No way. So there's going to be a lot of confusion in China for some time to figure out who's going to be in charge and so forth.
Robert, you've been with us for an hour and a half, and you've been sparkly and alert and doing great things, both talking to us privately first and then in your expose of how Taiwan fits into the East. Historically, you have been brilliant in bringing us up to date, and you've also been brilliant in telling us what you think as a realist is the best position that the United States can take vis-a-vis the, I think it was called the island of Formosa, wasn't it, once upon a time?
Yes, it was.
And now China, the three of them. So I'm going to hand you over to Mal, who is charming and is willing to appreciate all that you have done and I have done to make this happen. So take care.
Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Professor Robert Sutter, for your insightful and effective discussion today. It's a critical foreign policy subject, and you did a great job of conveying a timely and complex subject. I appreciate that. Don said it, but I would say as well, I know that I learned a great deal. Thanks also to Don, to today's host, to Joan, Carrie, and the staff of Chappaqua Library for their continued support. Thanks to all of you, off campus, wherever you are, for your continued participation in sport. On Monday, the 14th, we will host Professor James Williams, also from George Washington University, will address Japan and U.S. foreign policy, another critical and timely subject. Until we meet again, please stay well and stay safe. Joan?
Okay, right. Thank
It's
you
you.
all. Again, Robert, I add my kudos and thanks for everything that you've done and the presentation, which was excellent. And to Don and Mal, always, for all their help. So I will end the meeting now, and I thank all of you for coming. And just as a note, if you need anything, don't forget to go to our website to register for programs. The website address is chappaqua.library.org. And I left my email address for those of you who want a copy again of Professor Sutter's information. So thank you again for coming, and I will end it right now. Bye-bye,
Take care.
everyone.
Thanks all.
Bye, all.
Bye. Bye.